Hello, all! Resting is hard. Letting yourself actually take a break can be really hard, especially when you're dealing with internalized ablism or unlearning that your inherent value doesn't involve what labor you can provide for others. So here's a 20-minute or so video of relaxing music and weaving. If you can, please grab some sort of hydration, sit, rest, drink your fluids, take your meds, and just breathe for 20 or so minutes. If you need something to do with your hands, that's absolutely fine too. I'll be asking a question partway through if accountability helps you like it does me, but answering that question is entirely optional. Your resting isn't being lazy, it's preventative maintenance. Actually resting for 20 minutes now will help prevent burnout later. Yes, I'm being a bit of a hypocrite, but I'm also fully planning on using my own videos for my own rest times, so I'm in this too. My name is Took. I'm a disabled genderqueer weaver who's had life take odd turns, but who knows that even tattered and worn yarn still has value, and that tired joints and health flares don't have to stop the journey. I weave exclusively with secondhand fibers, aided with adaptive warping, HR and OSHA cats, and a wonderful found family. Welcome to Hawksong Weaving, where all our paths are a little bit warped. Today's question that is relevant to the situation you see right now: if you have ever accidentally trained, or you know someone who's accidentally trained an animal to respond to some sort of stimuli, what was it? What was the situation? For me, this is happening right now because I started listening to Epic the Musical, which is one of the soundtracks I use to expedite my emotional processing and figuring out how I feel about a situation, because autistic emotional interoception, it kind of sucks sometimes. If your nephew who's autistic doesn't have that, then shush, yeah, shush, autism is spectrum. But yeah, if you know something along those lines, how does it affect you and what's going on with your animals? And yeah. Thank you for resting. I'm so glad for the odd turn that your path took that brought you here. Thank you for spending time with me at Hawksong Weaving, where we're all a bit warped. And I hope you have a truly excellent week.